everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, North America's leading provider of employee communication resources, including video, websites, e-learning, social media, and virtual events to help you connect with your team. For more information, you can visit us online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Orqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. The rules for women are different, even in professional settings. Our voices are too soft or too loud. We take up too much room or too little. We're told to lean in, but also to smile. We are encouraged to be more assertive in the workplace, but when we are, we're deemed to be aggressive or even worse, rude. These rules impact everyone in the workplace, men and women alike, because when we're not all bringing 100% of ourselves to the job, the work suffers. So how can women navigate these contradicting messages and make work more manageable for everyone? Today, I'm joined by Rebecca Reid, a journalist based in London who knows these rules all too well. She is the author of Rude, Stop Being Nice and Start Being Bold, a book about how the right kind of rude can actually help women advance in their careers. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining me today on Project HR.
Thank you for having me.
So, Rebecca, I want to start out by talking about your work as a journalist. You're currently a columnist for The Telegraph. Where else might we have read your words?
So I write for a variety of publications, most of which are UK based, but actually increasingly with journalism, that doesn't really matter because we all read the same things. So I was the former digital editor of Grazia magazine, which actually is now launching in the US and I think Canada.
Oh.
And I also write for places like The Stylist, The Guardian, The Times, most of the broadsheet newspapers, and most of the I've done most of the glossies, it's the Glamour, Marie Claire, etc. So at this point, actually, I've got a long list on my phone, and I have done most of the women's publications in the UK. So I'm very proud of that.
Yes, for sure. So the writing is what led you to become a regular guest on Good Morning Britain, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so basically, for a good portion of my 20s, my job was basically to write something really contentious, and then be invited on television to say something really contentious.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes as a direct quote from my article, sometimes as a separate thing. I do less of it now, actually, because I found the emotional labour attached to it was quite enormous. And I think I had to learn that you can't really expect to be able to go on television, say things that you know are controversial, and then expect nobody to react to them.
Mm.
But yeah, that was a big part of my career throughout my 20s, and it was part of trying to make a name for myself, which, without wanting to kind of diverge too much too early, I think is a really interesting part of sort of women working in the creative arts and media. You have to make more of a splash to be able to do the bare minimum. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's how I started going on Good Morning Britain and sort of various shows like that for debates about various controversial topics.
So speaking about that emotional toll, one of those appearances is what inspired you to write this book. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so I had done Good Morning Britain quite a lot of times. I'm sure you guys probably have similar shows where you are, but basically you go on, they have invited somebody else who has like a diametrically opposed opinion to you, and then you sort of have a debate, but really you just shout over each other for like four and a half minutes,
Delightful.
and and nobody changes their mind. Whatever you thought when the debate started, you will still think at the end, and people like to have their kind of their bias confirmed. But so I was doing a debate about whether there should be any kind of limits in comedy. And my stance was that while I am obviously very pro free speech, because who isn't, I think there are some areas, sort of, racism, homophobia, sexism, arguably, which are best avoided in comedy. And the
Mm.
fellow guest was a comedian who felt the opposite. He felt that it was his right to be able to make jokes about everything. Now, actually, I agree that it was his right to make jokes about everything, but I don't think anybody is obliged to host you if you choose to make those
Mhm.
jokes.
Mhm.
But anyway, so this was the debate. It's a relatively nuanced topic, but of course it didn't really get much nuance. And
Mm.
he started saying, I'm a top comedian and I should be able to do la la la. And I said, well, I think actually, if you can't make jokes without being racist or sexist or whatever, then you're not very funny. And
Hmm.
I was about to make a sort of further point, and he had previously spoken quite a lot, and I had spoken very little. And he started to interrupt me. And
Hmm.
it was by far not the first time that I've been interrupted in a professional setting. Like, that has
I'm
happened
sure.
to me many times, as it has with, I would imagine, probably all women.
Mhm.
But for some reason, it just really, I think possibly because he had slightly been needling me before we went on. But I snapped, and it was my moment where I just went, no, I am not
Mm.
going to have men talking over me when it is literally I'm being paid to speak here. And so I started shushing him. So I literally put my finger to my lips and I was like, shh, like that. It's not perhaps the most mature thing that I've ever done.
Right.
But he was quite surprised, and he did eventually stop talking, and then I got to make my point. And then I realized as I was doing it, I could see myself out of the corner of my eye on the monitor, and I just thought, "Oh my god, this is gonna go down so badly." And I was
Mm,
right, it did go down very badly, because there was a sort of short-lived but very loud media circus of
mm,
people calling me Rebecca Rude, which is obviously a very clever pun on my surname, Reid.
mm. So what was the aftermath of that? What was the fallout?
So yeah, there was a lot of sort of short-lived. I mean, you can't really call it news in the same way anymore. It's not like it was, on the front page of the newspapers, but there were a lot of publications covering it. I got
Mm,
huge amounts of online. I mean, some of it abuse, some of it just feedback. I'm always very
mm,
careful because I don't like it when people call comments disagreeing with them trolling, but
mm.
sometimes it was like literal trolling.
Yeah.
And yeah, everybody thought it was hilarious. All my friends thought it was funny. I went home for Christmas and people kept shushing me as a joke.
Wow.
Yeah, it really, it really took on a life of its own. And then, but the best part of the aftermath, I suppose, is that I was having a conversation with my sister, and I said, I really want to write nonfiction. I want to try writing a nonfiction book, and I've got all these ideas, but I don't really know where to focus. And she said, "Well, why don't you talk about being rude?" And that was how the book kind of came to light.
So you kind of got the last laugh on that.
Well, I think it was a very profitable it was a profitable 4.5 minute segment.
There you go, right. So is it true today that you actually consider rudeness to be your superpower?
I think so, or at least it's interestingly, it was only really throughout doing the publicity for the book that I started to grasp that what I really meant was it's escaping the fear of being perceived as rude, and it's taking the negative out of the description. So I'm not saying that I think being horrible or rude or aggressive in that sense is my superpower. I think my
Mhm,
superpower is that I very rarely give a second thought to whether somebody is going to consider me rude. What I think
mhm,
about is, do I think I'm being reasonable? Do I think I'm being rude? Am I comfortable with this action? If the action that I'm taking were being reported on the news, would I stand by it?
mm.
Rather than what I used to do, which was thinking, what if they think I'm rude? What if they think I'm not nice? What if they think I'm horrible? Because I think, as we all know, you can't control what somebody thinks about you, no matter how hard you try.
For sure. So more self-assessment than worrying about what everybody else thinks. I like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what you mean when you say rude.
So I think when I talk about rudeness, in terms of my book, I'm talking about what I term positive rudeness, which is the rudeness which is prioritizing your own wants and needs above that of other people's, unless you are actively trying to be kind. So the way that I try to explain it often is that if you're standing in a queue and somebody steps in front of you, it's positive rudeness to say, "Excuse me, I was in front of you." Or it's kind if you think that person is stressed and having a bad day to consciously let them go in front of you. But the worst case scenario in this metaphor is to let them go in front of you and then quietly stew about it for the rest of the day because you didn't want them
Right.
to. You
Sure.
just didn't feel able to say anything.
Mhm.
And these are the kinds of small situations where rudeness is important. And the irony is, it's not rude to say, "Excuse me, there's a queue." That's
Mhm.
not rude at all, except it feels rude because we
Mm.
have been socialized to prioritize our wants and needs after other people's, not before.
Mhm.
And therefore, we do all of these things. In any given day, you might do 10 or 15 things, like let somebody go in front of you in the queue, which adds up to a lifetime of putting other people first. So,
Right.
positive rudeness is about not doing those things. And it's about auditing your generosity so that you're making conscious choices rather than being passively rather than passively allowing other people to step over you.
Mhm. So in the book, you refer to the last decade of your life as a journey to deprogram yourself. Can you explain a little bit by what you meant by that?
So I think that a lot of us are raised to view rudeness as a real sort of sin, and I think that particularly in childhood, girls are penalised more heavily for perceived rudeness than boys are. The gold standard for girls is good behaviour. The gold standard for boys is achievement, and that's within itself incredibly sad. And I had
Mm.
very good, very liberal parents. I was raised in a household where where the intention was never to treat boys and girls differently, but there was this kind of endemic sense that boys are rambunctious and playful and outgoing and physical, and girls are
Mhm.
less of that, all of which I
Mhm.
fully don't believe. Both based on having spent quite a lot of time working in childcare. I was a nanny in my late teens, early
Mm.
20s, and also having
Mhm.
spoken to a lot of people about it. I think it is an entirely societal construction that boys are inherently
Sure.
more of anything than girls, really.
Mm.
Um, that we know realistically that most of the stuff that makes us different comes in at puberty.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I had absorbed those messages that to be a good girl meant to please others and to put your own needs last and to be quiet and respectful and calm.
Mm.
All of which is stuff that I have spent, yeah, the last decade of my life trying to unlearn.
Mhm. So, does that mean that this positive rudeness is something that only women need to employ, or can men benefit from this mindset as well?
I think the positive rudeness is something that men and women can definitely benefit from, but I think that it's something that perhaps comes more naturally to men. I know that my male friends and my partner, none of them seem to really give much of a second thought after an interaction of, oh, did I say the right thing? Was that rude? Did I
Mhm.
seem bossy? Did I seem aggressive? So I think that any men for whom this is striking, no, absolutely should go forward with it as a mantra, but
Mhm.
in my experience, it's almost exclusively women who actually need this guidance.
Interesting. All right, Rebecca, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, we'll get into all the ways we can apply this positive rudeness at work. So stay with us.
Thanks to the Respectful Workplace for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Brand new for 2020, the Respectful Workplace is online harassment prevention that connects with your workforce so you can focus on growth and success. Download our free state-by-state guide to harassment prevention at therespectfulworkplace.net and get started today.
We're back with Rebecca Reid, author of Rude, Stop Being Nice and Start Being Bold. Rebecca, this book is really just so much fun. There's great advice in here, pop culture references. But I want to mention that while we're focusing on being rude at work in this podcast, the book actually addresses lots of other situations where polite rudeness can be used. Can you give our audience a brief overview of those other areas outside of work?
So I broke it down into what I thought were the major areas affecting women, particularly women in their sort of 20s and 30s. I think there is advice in there for women who are older than that, but it predominantly deals with that kind of age group, mostly because that's where I am.
Mm.
So it looks at rude in terms of health, which is, about making sure that your healthcare practitioner is taking you seriously. It's particularly
Mm.
good if you have gynecological issues, which are often really overlooked, or if you're somebody who has a slightly higher body weight, again, very often treated poorly in medical facilities, or if you are a woman of colour, again, very often gaslit by the medical profession. Not
Mm.
always,
Mhm.
not maligning all doctors, but
Mm.
it is an endemic problem. And then there is also read about money, weddings, friendship, sex, relationships, and
Mm.
dating. So it kind of gives a big overview. Weddings, funnily enough, wasn't really supposed to be its own chapter, but it's the area where women in their 20s and 30s seem to have the biggest problems because going to weddings becomes a full-time job with a second salary required.
Sure.
So that was the one where I heard some of the worst horror stories. But yeah, basically it charts all the areas of your life. And I think romantic relationships is also a really important one because it's somewhere that it's very easy to sleepwalk into bad decisions.
Mm.
But it's also somewhere where it's easy to make changes because if you're in a healthy relationship with somebody who loves you,
Mhm.
there will be room for shifts and changes within that dynamic.
Mhm. Interesting. So let's get back to rude at work. You start talking about work by discussing one of the most basic elements of human identity, which is our names. Now, how should we be positively rude about our names?
So, first and foremost, the most important thing that you can do when entering a new workplace is to introduce yourself with the name that you would like to be called by, and then do not allow anybody to deviate from that. So, I'm a white woman, so my name is Rebecca. It's a very sort of standardized Western name, but
Mhm.
people do always seem to want to make it into Becky or Bex or Becca, none of which are my name, and all of which are smaller and shorter than my name, meaning that I am taking up less space on the page
Mhm.
and in people's
Mhm.
mouths. It's a very small thing, but it does add up. And also,
Mhm.
it's a very strange thing to allow somebody else to decide a huge part of your identity having just met you. So in some cases, it's just a smaller saying. I say, "Hi, I'm Rebecca. Oh, what do you go by? Rebecca." And then
Mm-hmm.
often women feel the need to explain that further, like, "Rebecca, people used to call me Becky at school, but I didn't really like it." No need to do that. Just, yeah, it's Rebecca. And silence is always a really powerful tool because it's not aggressive or unkind, but it does send the message that the conversation's over. There's another side issue which I haven't personally experienced, but which we know is massively problematic, is pronunciation of people's names. So if you work with somebody whose name is, Russian or Polish or West African or of any other kind of non-Latin or Greek derivation, there may well be people who claim that it's too difficult for them, or who will ask you if they can call you by a different name. Now, I think we know in 2021 that asking a Black woman if you can call her Polly rather than whatever her real name is
Right.
wrong and stupid, but it does
Right.
still happen. And I know from my research that it's much harder for a Black woman to say, "No, that's not my name,"
Mm.
because Black women are perceived unfairly to be aggressive and strong and powerful in the
Mm.
way that white women are often perceived to be kind of delicate and sweet and like little fawns. But I think it is still worth having the fight if you feel able to. Perhaps, and this was a theme throughout the book because it's a difficult area in the sense that it's not my place to comment. All I can do is repeat what other people I interviewed said. But the general consensus was do it with a smile. And it's unfair that you have to do it with a smile, but do it with a smile, but still make the point. And for goodness sake,
Mm-hmm.
don't let people call you Mary because they can't pronounce your actual name.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's ridiculous and it's only going to make your life worse. Again, like so much of what's in the book, your name is a small thing, but it is also an enormous thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I do think it is always a fight that is worth having. There's nothing wrong with, if you need to, speaking to your HR department, repeating and mentioning this person has been using an incorrect name for me. Could you remind them? If you don't feel comfortable saying it to them directly. Also, I mean, really, if you could do it in a gentle way, sending round an email with a link to how to pronounce your name from a pronunciation thing on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
If people aren't doing it properly, there's no harm in that. You can put a smiley face. I'll give you permission to put a smiley face emoji in your email, which usually I very much disapprove of,
Uh-huh.
if it makes you feel more able to do it. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but have the fight in the gentlest possible way, but do have the fight.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely relate to that because being a Jennifer, people are constantly trying to make that smaller. Jen, Jenny.
Yeah,
And
Jenny,
I don't
Jen.
mind yeah, Jenny I can't take. Jen I can handle. But in a professional setting, I want to be Jennifer. So I completely relate to that there.
People don't feel the same need to do it to men. If a man is called Richard and he says, "My name's Richard," people won't call him Ricky or
Mhm.
Dick without his
Mhm.
permission. But
Mhm.
Richard and Rebecca are not dissimilar lengths. And it is
Mhm.
extraordinary the way people will do it to me and they won't do it to a Richard.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, as women, how we communicate at work and the words we use, both verbal conversation and written messages, can really derail us. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, written messages are a very complicated, very important part of how we send out messages about ourselves in the workplace. And we're saying way more than we're actually saying every time we send an email.
Mm.
It's not a completely original thought, but it's worth talking about exclamation marks, which
Mm.
are a lot of women's bête noire. I am particularly bad for it, and I catch myself doing it all the time.
Mhm.
Somehow, and I don't use exclamation marks when I talk to my friends. I don't use them in text or WhatsApp messages ever. It's extraordinary to me to think I would. And yet, if I'm sending a professional email, I have to put about 9 exclamation marks in so everyone thinks I'm a nice person. It's extraordinary. And actually, all it does is, well, it makes you seem like you've got a sort of questionable grasp of grammar, or that you're really bizarrely perky. Um, so I would strongly suggest that every time you send an email, I mean, I've tried to wean myself off them. That's been my
Mhm.
tendency. So trying to get down to 2 per email or 1 per paragraph, and then
Sure.
finally 1 per email. And also, there is an element of like, if you do it, like if you send an email with no exclamation mark, you will find that people don't get upset. It's okay, but you have to take that first step and see that it's all right.
Sure.
Similarly, like smiley face emojis, thumbs up emojis, all of those kinds of please like me, I'm not a horrible person, coded messages. They can all go.
Mhm.
If you're making a reasonable request, stand by it. And then there are also various other written tricks that women tend to fall into. Just is a really bad one. I was just wondering if there was any
Mm,
chance that you could possibly, and that is a sentence. I was just wondering if there's any chance that you could possibly, is a sentence that I write weekly and I have to
mm,
delete it because
mhm,
that sentence doesn't mean anything. I was just wondering if there's any chance that you could possibly does not mean anything. What I'm trying
mhm,
to say is, would you or could you? That's two
mhm,
words. And I think one of the ways that I helped myself in terms of trying to reprogram my behavior is I found ways of making things that felt rude be actually equally polite. So using two words rather than nine is actually a kind of politeness because it's taking up less of
mhm,
somebody else's time. So
mhm.
finding the benefit in what you're doing for the other person in order to convince yourself can be a useful step.
Mhm. And you mentioned, and you've alluded to this earlier, but you mentioned in the book that women often apologize more than men, and even that just phrase that you just talked about, that's a bit of an apology before you're giving your ask. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why women tend to apologize more?
Yeah, we love apologizing. I think we have been taught, this is, quite large scale feminist theory, but I think we have been taught that we don't deserve the space that we have, which is partially because the workplace system was designed when women didn't work. So there
Mm,
is still this hangover that it's not ours, we're not meant to be there, we're trespassing on somebody else's space, and
hmm,
therefore we should be grateful and we should be, and you see it particularly in women who have children. They are so sorry for being there and having children. How dare they try and work and have a job? How awful of them. And you see that, and I think women who have children are even worse for apologizing because it's, I've only stayed 10 minutes over the allotted time that I'm paid to be here. I'm so sorry for leaving, rather than
hmm,
I stayed 10 extra minutes. Aren't you guys lucky?
mm,
Um, but I think the most useful trick that I took from writing the book overall is that very often I say sorry when I mean thank you. So I
mm,
do it in all walks of life. I might say to my partner, "I'm so sorry for being so emotional," and what I meant is, "Thank you for being so kind to me." And I
mm,
say, "I'm so sorry I'm late," when I'm only,
mhm,
a couple of minutes, like negligible lateness, couple of minutes.
mhm,
When what I mean is, "Thank you so much for waiting. I'm so
mhm,
sorry for asking you to do this report. Thank you so much for putting that time in it." And
mm,
actually, a person gets a much nicer experience from you if you thank them than they do if you apologize to them. Apology is
mhm.
negative, thanking is positive.
Sure. Also outward as opposed to inward. So,
Exactly, exactly.
do you have any tips or ideas for men in the workplace? If they see a woman who's acting in this way, is there anything that a male colleague could do to sort of support that woman and say, you don't need to apologize?
I think it's a difficult one because you don't want to come across as patronizing and you don't
Right.
want to come across like you're trying to manage somebody who is not your responsibility to manage. And there's nothing worse than when somebody wants to live out their like avuncular fantasy, but they're actually the same level as you. Um,
Right.
but I think if you are managing women who are apologizing all the time, there is nothing wrong with saying, and I would just say it almost like you just did, keep it really light, really quick. You are apologizing a lot and you really don't have to. When I first sort of noticed the tendency, I was working on a desk at a newspaper, and my boss at the time had an apology jar. And if you apologized, you had to put 50p into the jar. And then at the
I
end
like
of
it.
the week, all of the like, it was like a swear jar, and all the
Yeah.
money used to go to the person who apologized the least. So you could also, if you have like a fun workplace with that kind of, scenario, you can do a star chart or a swear jar or something like that. If you're in a more formal workplace, I mean, obviously, I would suggest giving people copies of my book because I think that would be incredibly helpful.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
also,
of course.
I think having that open and comfortable conversation of, have you noticed that Brad doesn't ever apologize? That's because Brad's a man, and you could do it the same way.
Mhm,
But I think if you are in a more formal workplace, then it's looking at things like putting in assertiveness workshops or
mm,
online training and things like that.
mhm.
And I think it's always very easy for me to give advice that's based on living in like a lovely hippie workspace where we're all friends and we talk about our feelings. But I know that not everybody works and not everyone's a writer.
Right, 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 but I'm all about creative solutions. So going off of that idea of the apology swear jar, what kind of language should we avoid if we're to be more assertive with our communications?
I think the main ones are just, sorry, and I think anything over explaining. So when I
Mm,
write an email, I tend to sort of do 10 lines of why I need somebody to do something. And that's not necessary. And it makes me seem considerably less confident, and it makes me seem very apologetic. And I think if you can undo those things, then
Hmm.
people will believe you more. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're able to communicate in a clear, concise, and confident way, people will treat you in accordance with that, and then you'll feel more able to do it. So, like with a lot of things, the first steps with this are often really the hardest.
Mm-hmm. So, communication can also be an issue in group settings, like meetings. And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, where you were talking about being talked over. And in the book, you address a tactic that can be used during office meetings called heap eating. Can you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, so it's a relatively common phenomenon. I noticed it first at university, where you would be in like a seminar, or like a small teaching group, and there'd be a girl there with her copy of, I did English literature, so it'd be the copy of the book with like 45 coloured post-it notes in it, and she's written 50 bullet points, and she's read this book 9 times, and she's also read the Spark Notes, and she also watched the film, and she makes a really great point. And then some guy who arrived 5 minutes late goes, "Yeah, no, I just really like what she said. And I just think, like, when she said this, it was really interesting." And basically repeat her central argument as his
Mm-hmm.
own.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
frustratingly, in an academic setting, I would very often find that the tutor, usually male, would be like, "Yeah, that was a fascinating point, James." And it'd be like, "I'm sorry, what about Jane, who stayed up all night reading this book?" And in the workplace, it's often a little bit less pronounced than that, but it is still very common that a woman will perhaps over explain a point because she's not quite confident enough to say it in 2 sentences. He will then take the idea, distill it down into 2 sentences because he's got the confidence. And then all anybody will remember is that Max said it in 2 sentences. No one
Mm-hmm.
remembers it that Sarah did it in 5. So when heap eating happens, the important thing is not to just let it go. So the gold standard would be for Sarah to say, "Yes, that's exactly what I just said." Um,
I like it.
if you're not in a position to do that for whatever reason, and lots of workplaces are not kind to women, I always think it's important to give advice that can be used if you're not in a gold standard workplace. Then what I actively suggest to women is that they try to find themselves a work buddy who you so Sarah and Helen. If Sarah is being heap-eated, Helen calls it out, and if Helen's being heap-eated, Sarah calls it out. Because I think we are generally kinder to people for acting on behalf of others than they are to acting on behalf of themselves.
Mm,
And we're less defensive towards women who act for others.
mm,
This is also a really good system, I would say, in terms of bragging. I'm very pro bragging. I think it's very important. And I think women often kind of suck at it. So your heap eating buddy can also be your brag buddy, who does a lot of, "Did you see the incredible report that Helen wrote?
mm,
Did you
mhm,
notice that Sarah stayed 2 hours late last night?" But I think the major thing that you can do is find somebody who can support you,
mhm,
and who you can support, and create that network within your workplace.
mhm. All right, Rebecca, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraquah, and our guest today is Rebecca Reid, author of Rude, Stop Being Nice and Start Being Bold. We are back. So, positive rudeness helps us all find our voices in the workplace, and that's important when it comes to a whole host of issues, starting with our paychecks. The gender pay gap does exist. Right now in the United States, for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns about 81 cents, less if you're a woman of color. And it's something that we've often talk about in HR circles. Can positive rudeness play a part in helping us achieve better pay equity?
So yes, it absolutely can. But the important thing, firstly, to say is that there is a perception that women don't ask for pay rises, which is
Mm,
generally regarded, at least I know in the UK, to not be true.
mm,
I think women are perhaps queasier about asking for pay rises, and I think we probably are less good at it than men, but we do it.
mhm,
And very often, women ask for pay rises and aren't given them.
mm,
And then also, very depressing research that I found said women tend to be penalised for having asked.
hmm,
Um, and that is a systemic problem that you cannot personally change. If
mm,
your workplace regards women who ask for more money as ungrateful or greedy,
hmm,
there is nothing that you can personally do about that, unfortunately. And
mhm,
I think it's always really important not to sort of point out a problem that women experience and then blame them for it themselves. It's not women's fault that women are often unfairly penalised for asking for more money. However, we need to try and be practical and pragmatic within this situation. So, yes, Step one is being able to ask for a pay rise, and that is really important. Step
Hmm.
two is knowing how to ask for pay rises, and this is the big thing. This is the kind of information gap, I think. We know that women do ask, and we know that women don't get. So I'm assuming, based on all of the research that I did, there is often a problem with how women ask. So, for instance, if you ask for a pay rise in an email, it is infinitely easier to say no because it's so much easier to say no to somebody in writing than it is in person.
Hmm.
Women, I think, often ask for pay rises in a way that makes it as easy as possible for the provider to say no, whereas I think men are more likely to ask for a pay rise in a way that makes it very hard to say no.
Hmm.
So you need to ask in person, and you need to go in with you need to go in armed with all the information. It can't just be, I've worked here for 4 years and I think I do a really good job. That doesn't cut it. It might if you work in a really nice workplace, and it should work like that, but it often doesn't. So it needs to be, when would be a suitable time for us to sit down for a pay review? And a pay review
Hmm.
should be an easily available part of your job. Then going in and saying, I have worked here for X amount of time. In that time, I have seen this grow or this change or this improve. I was directly responsible for this, 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 and this. I am hoping that in the next quarter, the next year, the next month, I can make this, this, and this happen. That is why I'm looking for a pay rise of, and then asking for a specific amount of money. For instance, I've looked at comparable jobs. I can see that if I were to be at XYZ company, I'd be making this amount of money. I'm
Hmm.
asking that you match that. Or
Hmm.
I've noticed that other companies have a agreement where they get a 1% increase each year. So going in with lots of data and statistics, because
Hmm.
at the end of the day, asking for a pay rise is a sales pitch. And it's not you shouldn't be asking for a favor. And I think too often women don't want to ask, do the asking in a half-assed way, and
Hmm.
then the worst case scenario is that they've done the asking, but they didn't ask well, they didn't get the money, they've demonstrated themselves to be a relatively unconvincing salesperson, and they've made themselves seem unhappy or like they might be looking for other work. And
Hmm.
that is that's a pretty consistently bad outcome
Yeah, not a
from
good place to
asking
be.
for a raise.
Yeah. Basically, positive rudeness helps us set boundaries at work, even when it comes to avoiding things like burnout or learning to say no. I'm essentially getting to the point where positive rudeness actually contributes to a more respectful workplace. Would you say that that's true?
I think it absolutely does, or it at least sets an expectation that if you're not respectful, it will not be tolerated. It's a really difficult area because you never want to be saying women should be able to just say no toughly and then nothing will happen. That's not the case, and lots of very tough women experience very real sexual harassment. However, women are taught to prioritize other people's happiness and comfort over their own. So
Mm.
they don't always feel able, when a relationship starts to take an uncomfortable direction, to say, whoa, what the hell do you think you're doing? And I think there are situations where there are genuine misunderstandings. And if the person, and don't get me wrong, the person in power should never be making any kind of advances to the person in a position of lesser power.
Mhm. Mhm.
However, unfortunately, it does happen, and we
Mhm.
we haven't equipped women very well to deal with that situation. Now, they shouldn't ever have to deal with that situation, but it is a situation that arises. Therefore, women need to be better equipped to deal with it, which
Mhm.
means saying, "Whoa, you are old enough to be my dad," or something like that, that puts
Mhm.
somebody in their place in that moment. Similarly, we need to encourage women that going to HR, talking about this, documenting it, making records of this, all of that stuff's really important. But there are people, and a lot of people, who don't work in big corporate companies with a reporting structure and an HR department, but
Mhm.
who work in, a five-person small family business where a hand on a thigh would not be believed. And
Mm.
that is where you need to empower women to say, take your hand off my leg right now, in a
Mhm.
way that says, do not do that again, because that's unfortunately sometimes the only avenue. But again, I never want to suggest that it's women's fault and women should be fixing
Mhm.
it. It's
Mhm.
not women's fault, but sometimes women do have to fix it unfairly. And then also, I think in terms of boundaries, it's a really, really important conversation in the workplace. And I think women often feel that it's rude not to answer emails or reply to phone calls outside of working hours. But I
Mm.
would say that, and this probably isn't helpful if you've been in a job for a long time and you're not going anywhere, but when you start a role, set the expectation that you will not be on your phone or on your computer past certain hours, because if you've never done it, people can't expect you to do it. And
Hmm.
you need to just be very clear within your own mind. You are paid for a certain number of hours. I recommend that if you get into a stage where people are expecting you to work outside of your working hours, calculate the week of hours they'd like you to work, then work out how much you're being paid per hour if you do it. And I think that's often a very shocking realization.
Yeah, not some math most people want to do.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
so tell me how our listeners can find out more about you and where they can get your book.
So my book is available to purchase on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And also, I think you can order it through your local bookshops, which would be even better.
Hmm.
And you can follow me. I'm actually currently on a Twitter break because I wrote a contentious article and I can't cope with the fallout. But I'm sure I'll be back before long. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Rebecca CN Reid. And yeah, just give me a Google and you can read everything else I've written if you're interested.
Nice. Perfect. And I want to let our listeners know that links to Rebecca's author pages and a link to where you can buy Rude, Stop Being Nice and Start Being Bold will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Rebecca, it is time for our lightning round of questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Question number 1 is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about positive rudeness. In your opinion, which of these actual Emily Post etiquette rules for women is more ridiculous in the 21st century? Never leaning back in a chair or never refusing to shake someone's hand?
Oh, the chair one's definitely worse because you've got to be able to refuse to shake people's hands. It's Corona time.
Yes, for sure. All right. So tell us, what is the best book you've read recently?
The best book I have read recently is called Insatiable. It's by Daisy Buchanan, but I don't know if it's available outside of the UK. So I'm going to say best one that is available is Cobble Hill by Cecily von Weisler.
Nice. What is your favorite thing about being a writer?
Not really having a boss.
Perfect. So what is the best piece of advice that you've ever been given?
Your anxiety is lying to you.
Nice. I like that. And so finally, who or what inspires you?
It's really difficult. All of the women I know, genuinely all of the women I know in different ways.
Love that. All right. So I wanted to thank you for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really great fun.
So thanks to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR or know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. On Twitter and Facebook, you can find us at Projections, and you can also find us on LinkedIn at Projections Inc. And last, but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply rate us 5 stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.